Welcome to Windows on the World. As I say nearly every week at the moment, another action-packed show full of information and something that people have been wanting me to talk about. I've had quite a lot of messages about this, even though we've covered it a lot in the past. The whole concept of the free man on the land concept and what it's really about and how that's been tied in to other things and being used to lead people into a cul-de-sac, because there are certain premises around it that are very interesting and do exhibit how the system actually works. But unless you are discerning and able to really understand these concepts, then you will get steered into the dead end. Yes, and we all know where that leads. That leads into one of our guest commentators who will be on the show tonight. So tonight we are going to examine these manufactured cul-de-sacs and have a look at what is being used to steer those of little discretion into very predictable dead ends. And there's never been a time where there have been more cul-de-sacs than the present time. I've seen this sort of resistance over the past few years, but over the past 15 years, and there has never been the amount of misinformation and steering going on than is happening at the moment, which of course coincides with the whole of the Global Action Plan, because the globalists indeed need the anti-globalists to implement their policies. So if you've got these octogenarians gluing themselves to the road, as in Insulate Britain, which is a lobbying group, which is basically a globalist lobbying group, or you've got people driving round the M25, slowing the traffic down on a Sunday, calling itself a convoy, going round in circles, they are basically doing the job of the state, because it's just going to wind everybody up and make the opposition look unpopular, which, of course, is the whole idea of the steering. So there is, at this point in time, a need to conserve and regenerate brain cells, as so many are already dead and millions more are dying out there. Yes, it's not just the injection schedule. Brain cells are dying off as well. Of course, as whole bodies. But from the information out there, the model for resistance in the UK does seem to be a bit common law Malcolm at the moment. So tonight we're going to examine the manufactured cul-de-sacs, have a look at what is being used to steer those of little discretion into these predictable dead ends, and often worse. So we'll be looking at some interesting esoteric stuff as well. Mark, I've got some news. Oh, Malcolm's in. Mark, no, listen, it's so exciting. The common law peace convoy on the M25 is now a mobile common law court, Mark. As we are driving round the M25 at 30 miles an hour, making our point to everybody else out there, we are trying those people in the house known as number 10, Mark. This is massive news. Massive. They're all being tried as we're driving around the M25. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah, the cases are being held whilst we go round in circles, Mark. What could be more empowering to hear than this? It couldn't get any better, could it? We are winning, Mark. We're winning. Thanks, Malcolm. Very symbolic. That's exactly what we're going to be talking about on tonight's show. At last, Mark, you are talking about real flesh and blood sovereign beings, not globalism or communitarianism, but common law, Mark. I'm glad you're on the right side of history. We are winning. We're winning. I'm going to have a cup of tea now. See you later. Well, thanks a lot, Malcolm. And thanks a lot for that. Despite the information from Malcolm, the planet is going round in circles to some degree or other. So, yeah, I'm going to be talking about an article tonight called Freeman versus Legal Fiction, which was written in 2017, but the information in there goes way back to about 2010. And we're going to have a look at the whole history of this and why people get wrapped up into issues which are of no importance and which don't really help them in the long run. In fact, they use the whole concept to basically give their property back to the state without realising it. So, yeah, it's called Freeman versus Legal Fiction. There's several more articles which I would recommend as well. There's one called What is Common Law, which has many articles linked to it. And one is called Are Administrative Courts Unlawful? And that is well worth a read. There's another one called Are You a Pauper? Which is all about your birth certificate being incorporated. And we're going to be touching on that tonight. and another one called Is a Birth Certificate a Death Certificate, which goes into the Cestui Que Act of 1540 and the later one of 1666, which means that when you are registered to the state and you don't claim back your sovereignty by the age of 7, you are deemed to be lost at sea. Which means, of course, that you are deemed to be dead in the eyes of the system, so you can be administrated against. It's all deep occult stuff, but very interesting, and I found it fascinating to start with. It helps in certain ways, but in other ways, and in many ways, it's a bit of a dead end. But yeah, we were laughing about all this the other day, and we had a few jokes. So I just put this joke in, and it's about going into court, and it kind of sums the whole thing. So I am not the legal fiction represented by my birth certificate. So the judge then just butts in and says, well, I can see that, just take a seat. In other words, it doesn't mean a damn thing, because if you go in there and try and do all that, then the court will administer you whether you are there or not. It doesn't matter in an administrative court whether you are there or not, because if you don't turn up, you will be administered against, and if you don't actually get involved in proceedings, you will also be administered against. So by not representing yourself as a legal fiction in an administrative court, you're slightly shooting yourself in the foot, so you might as well go home. This article there, Freeman versus Legal Fiction, was posted on the 7th of April 2017. So it basically looks at the free man on the land concept. Now, there are important issues to address, as this information has definitely been distorted and misinterpreted by many well-meaning but extremely gullible people, and also those thinking that it is an easy fix. It has also been used to deliberately mislead people, and it is being used at the moment, and has been over many years, for the stealing of property by the state and interested parties, including property developers and people involved with major corporations. So yes, it's been used to mislead people. So the free man on the land concept has been used to basically mislead people into losing their property. And those who have benefited from the gullibility and misfortunes of those who have fallen for misinformation are basically the winners. So remember, this was written in 2017, but the whole concept went back to, the mid-2000s, really, this whole idea of free man on the land. And it's far from an easy solution, but it does reveal some profound truths. Now, this concept started out, this free man concept, it means that basically, as a free human being, a divine human being, then you are not your registered birth certificate. Well, of course you're not. You can be your registered birth certificate when you want to partake in the benefit privileges of the state, which you are assumed to actually partake in when you have been registered, including, of course, taxation and imprisonment. These are benefit privileges of the state once you participate in the system. So I think the idea with this is not to say I'm not the legal fiction, because a legal fiction is just something that's created. That just means you've put something on paper, basically, so you can then have it transferred between two interested parties. It's just a way of exchange. And there's a book called The Development of Admiralty Law, which I've read, and that has great descriptions of how from the 1200s onwards lawyers were getting concerned that the law of admiralty, the law of the sea, which is this law of commerce, which is used in the administrative courts, was being used on the land. It was then banned, apparently, and by the 1800s it was meant to have been wiped out, but it has made a huge resurgence, and it's people's gullibility that gets them into trouble. So let's look at the land issue of land and freedom. And the whole thing, let's get into it. So the free man on the land concept, it started out being publicised on the internet by innovative thinkers like Rob Menard in Canada. And it was circulated on YouTube and into groups around 10 to 15 years ago. But it had been going for quite a while in Canada and the US. It was much bigger there. It really started out there and spread over here. So first, let's look at the issue of land and freedom, which under administrative law, the administrative law system, would mean liberty, because you are incorporated through a birth certificate and registration, which means that the state have certain controls, assumed controls over you, which of course they don't really have, because once you know your way around this stuff, you realize that this legal entity is not you. The real you is separate from that. And once you start seeing that, then you can start ducking in and out of the system as necessary. In other words, not by going into court and saying I'm not the legal fiction, because it doesn't make a damn bit of difference whether you are or whether you're not. The outcome is still going to be the same. In fact, if you persist like that, it will be a lot worse. And it led to some remarkable discoveries. It led to some remarkable discoveries for me about how the system actually works. So I found it really beneficial just trying different concepts out like this. But a lot of people are being led by gatekeepers and people with a vested interest in them basically not being competent. So yes, the issue of land and freedom. Now, since this article was written, Freeman versus Legal Fiction, things have got even further into financial fraud. The concepts being used to steer people into losing their property have been pushed relentlessly. And to the recently indoctrinated groups, such as these Telegram groups, pretty much all the Facebook groups, there is so much comedy, though, in this material. But after requests to go into the most common cul-de-sac, which is this Freeman on the land concept, I'm just reiterating tonight some information about it in that article. So do have a look at it. It's called Freeman versus Legal Fiction. It's the title of an article at windowsontheworld.net. Put that into the search bar and several articles will come up, including one called Are Administrative Courts Unlawful? And according to Halsbury's Laws of England, they are, and that goes into the council tax courts. So, other articles which are linked to this are The Age of Constant Distraction, about the abuse of trust law, which is quite prevalent too. That's worth a look. And yes, what is common law? Take a look at that article, What is Common Law? It gives you the definitions of common law by Matthew Hales, this barrister from the 1700s, and those sources are about as good as it gets, so it's worth having a look at that one. Well, basically what we're doing here is we're looking at the rights of use, which is called usufruct. Now that goes into everything. You only have the rights of use of property. Say if you buy a house, you don't own it, you own the title deed. And when you die, obviously the house goes to someone else, so you can never actually own property, but you can hold property. There's a big difference between holding property and owning it. You can't actually own it within this system. So that's something a lot of people don't know about, and they take for granted that they have rights which they actually don't have. And one of the reasons I'm doing this show tonight is it's going to get a lot worse. So if you don't know your way around how debt collectors work versus bailiffs, for instance, and how debt collectors are basically purchasers of debt and they don't have any rights to enforce that debt, but bailiffs do. And of course, bailiffs have been privatized. They were privatized 10 to 15 years ago. And that's when we saw a move within the administrative courts, the county court, to steal property with the help of lawyers working for debt collection companies. So basically they were using what's called court bailiffs to recover debts which were very small, which could mean the loss of property. And once they get into that property and take it, it's extremely difficult to get it back. But there were several cases where they just did let them take the property and the property was taken back. You can have a look at that video actually from years ago, and it was called Forced Evictions, Windows on the World, Forced Evictions. There's two very interesting cases on there which might give people a bit of a wake-up call about how easy it is for the government or private corporations to actually steal houses. So people make big mistakes with this stuff by not being the legal fiction or understanding how legal fictions actually work, because debts are, of course, legal fictions once they are sold. Now, once the debt is sold, say there's a company called Interlaken, Frederickson International, set up in the 1930s. So they basically buy debt. So your old Vodafone bill, it didn't pay. They buy it, and they then write you a series of letters trying to get you into a contract. So what they will do is say, we have an account with you. Well, they don't have an account with you because an account must be set up with your signature and theirs, and there must be an officer who signs that off. And of course there isn't. They're just issuing a piece of paper. So if you go back to the debt collector and say, well, I need to see the deed of assignment, when did the creditor, who I owe the money to, assign you that debt to collect it on their behalf? Well, usually they didn't, because the company bought the debt. Therefore, by buying it, the debt was extinguished. They bought your debt because your debt was sold by the creditor. So the creditor sold the debt. So you no longer owe the creditor any money because they've sold that debt. They've deemed that you can't get it back. So the debt collection company try and recover that debt because they've bought so many of them. They buy huge tranches of debt and they gamble on what they can get back. If you know what you're doing, you do not have to get involved at that level. I don't give legal advice, but I have given advice to people. And what I will say is this: everything that we do has actually worked. I wouldn't put anything out that didn't work. So you need to know what you're doing. And the problem I've always found is that you explain things to people and they miss out a part of the process, and then they blame you for what they've done, which is really one of the big problems with all this. Yes, and another thing is, of course, with land and issues like Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, is that now we have huge land grabs. This has been talked about all the time, this rewilding, and these farmers basically being approached by Savills, the estate agents, to buy their land, to basically rewild it. Well, rewilding is a land grab. Savills were involved in the purchase of all the council houses in 2016. The London council houses were sold to Savills, and we did loads of shows on this. It all ties in to basically how this system operates. It's land piracy now. So people talking about common law in relation to this are kind of missing the point, because these people are involved in massive financial fraud with the complicity of the courts. That's why Malcolm likes to set his own common law court up, you see, which is basically his own little fantasy world with Freeman Day from Bromley. And they have a whale of a time, but really what they're doing is not and will never get anywhere. Yes, so basically land is claimed by the Crown in the UK, and even worse under UN Global Action Plan, Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, which is where the land grabs have been going on since the 80s, with the Global Environmental Facility lending money to countries and basically then taking the land off them when they didn't pay it back. And that's really what Agenda 21 is all about. It's not an environmental project. The reason I'm saying this is because Agenda 21 adequately describes what's going on, because that is the system that's been used even to take your house from you. So the issue of claims, anyone can make a claim. Let's have a look at what a claim is. A claim is often bogus. It's not real. It's just something, if you make a claim, it doesn't have to have any standing or merit. In fact, most claims don't. But unless the claim is defended by you, then you can lose. So basically, if you acquiesce, and I've seen a lot of people copying this stupid thing of no contract return to sender, that's called acquiescence. You've agreed by not responding. So whatever was in that letter, you've agreed to by not responding. So anyone who says no contract return to sender knows nothing of what they're talking about, because acquiescence means that you've accepted what's in the letter. So the issue of claims goes right back to assumptions of ownership made by Pope Boniface on behalf of the Vatican under Papal Bull Unum Sanctum from 1302. Now, basically this put the whole of the world and its contents, including you, under the Holy Roman Empire and being administered by the Pope, the Emperor. Now, this meant that anybody who did not see the Pope as the head of the Universal Church, and indeed the Catholic global structure, let's call it basically a business through the Vatican, if you didn't adhere to that, then you were deemed not to be part of the system, and at worst you could be deemed a heretic and burnt at the stake, but at best you would be ostracized from the system, which is exactly what the present system is all about. It doesn't matter whether it's socially or financially. That's exactly what all this nonsense with Spotify and the Joe Rogan thing and these virtue signaling octogenarians who are making bloody fools of themselves, in my opinion, deserting because they want to virtue signal. It's exactly the same thing. Not as serious, but in a way it is serious, because what we're seeing here is this new culture of shaming anything that's outside the narrow corridor of accepted opinion. So yes, this means that within this assumption, you are an indebted serf on a plantation. So basically, under this system, you are an indebted serf on a plantation. because the land is not yours either. And this is where these assumptions are made. Again, these are just assumptions. These are assumptions. It doesn't mean they're real, but because they've remained undefended or they've been imposed on people, they go along with them. So in some ways, the free man on the land concept was trying to redress the balance, but what it's actually done is made people incredibly ignorant as to where they are in the system and made their response to it, most cases, I would say, worse. And there's a great book, actually, if you want to know about land ownership. A friend of mine from years ago, Kevin Cahill, he wrote a book called Who Owns the World? And it's a comprehensive list of land ownership. He also did another one called Who Owns Britain? Which is, again, very interesting too. I'm going to have a bit of a break now, and we're going to come back. This is quite heavy going, actually, so I'm putting a lot of information here. This is a sort of show you might want to listen to again at some point, but there's going to be a lot of info on this, and I might do some more of them, because there's a lot of people asking me to do this, and I've laid a lot of these concepts out very simply in those articles. So do have a look at the articles, and there's some videos linked to that article, What is Common Law? And there's 3 different shows all about how this system works. And it's Kevin Boyle is asking me questions as to how the administrative system works. I'm trying to respond to those questions, and we go through all these points. So if you find this a little bit complicated, then do have a listen to those. That was quick. Welcome back. That was Bartholomew's Fair. Yeah, we're talking really about what we are in the system. Once we're registered, our birth certificate incorporates us as a legal entity, which can then be used for transference of assets or liabilities in the system. And if you have a birth certificate, you enjoy the benefits of the system which you've been born into, which can, of course, include taxation and imprisonment, as well, of course, as the benefits of the society, which includes your pension, if you can get one, and the benefit system. So in a way, universal credit is part of this. So it all goes back to the registration at birth of the person. The person is then incorporated and is put on a register or a roll, and the name is put into the Gazette, and basically you have this long-form birth certificate which can be used as a future on the international stock market. It doesn't mean, however, that that money is yours. This is the kind of childish nonsense that has been put around on the internet for years. A legal fiction is just that. If you are being used as a legal fiction, as a future on the international stock market on the back of the GDP of the country, the gross domestic product of the country, to borrow money against, then there is no money. There's a future, and it's what you are deemed to be worth to the country that you are in. And of course, this can be also transferred through council tax account numbers. This is where the land piracy really started as well, because remember when all those councils were investing money and they started up these credit unions? Well, I found out that they were using my council tax account. I don't pay that anymore, but years ago when I looked into it, I found that the bailiff company had revealed that they were using a credit union reference number for my council tax account, which would imply that that account number was being used as a future. So all this stuff is legal fiction. So basically, when people tell you your birth certificate's worth millions, well, if it's worth millions, it's got nothing to do with you, because basically it's been registered and it's used by the state. So it's used merely because we live in a bankrupt fiat currency system to put futures on the international stock market for the gross domestic product of the country. I found my own birth certificate on Fidelity Investments, which was in America, and I was given a trader's reference to look for bond numbers, and I did come up in it, and so did a friend of mine, and I was Maryland Income Fund bond number 429 with a QSIP number. So this whole concept of futures and bonds being created on the back of your potential worth and what you're deemed to be worth is basically there so the money can be borrowed to bankroll the country. That's how it seems to work. Of course, it gets a little bit more complicated because of the huge amount of debt and the land piracy and the fraud that basically is a huge amount of international fraud behind this. That's how the whole thing works. So if you're looking at a system which is meant to be balanced, it certainly isn't this one. So yes, it means basically within this system there's an assumption that you are an indebted serf on a plantation, and this is where your inalienable rights come in, rights that cannot be liened, charged or even withdrawn. Now, the new Bill of Rights that's been bandied about by the government will take this away completely, because your rights will be at the expense of this word called community, which is basically the global system. So in other words, you cannot have individual rights which go against the perceived rights of the global community, which is the most tyrannical and reversed way of looking at it that could be imagined, because that means that your inalienable rights as a human being have gone. Of course, the UN Human Rights Act took your human rights away because you were then described as a person who had rights under the law. We're talking here about the reintroduction of Noahide law, which means that those who are not deemed to be Noahides can be administered against in a different kind of way, which means basically in old-fashioned terms and very radical terms that it can lead up to capital punishment like beheading if you do not adhere to the perceived Noahide laws. Now, they're not the laws that Noah received. They're not those laws. Those laws are written down, but the Noahide laws have to be adhered to in the Noahide court, which is what the UN want to do by taking away your human rights. That's why when you go and cross a road on a rainbow, it's nothing to do with LGBTQ. It's to do with the Noahide laws, because the rainbow came after the flood, and it was the new covenant with God. Now, we're not going to get too much into that tonight, but I've done a couple of shows on it. Rainbow Death Cult is one of them. Very esoteric stuff and very creepy. So all those people who are clapping the NHS with rainbows, they're actually clapping for their own demise, which is the kind of mindset that the globalists have. You have to consent. Remember, it's all about consent. So, yeah, we've covered quite a lot so far. The main idea behind the Freeman concept revolves around a fictional entity being created through your registration to the state by your birth certificate or bond. The idea is that because this is not the real you, that somehow this non-fictional you is not liable for the assumed liabilities of this legal name. And that's the Freeman on the land argument, which doesn't work. And this includes state-collected debts, taxes and fines. Now, there's people who say, yeah, but it works for me. I don't pay council tax and don't pay tax. Well, neither do I. But these concepts are not the way to do it. There are ways around everything. There are always loopholes, what they call legal loopholes within the system. And there's a lot of people who get away with things for quite a long time. But if they've just been going along thinking that it's because they're not a legal fiction, they will have a hell of a shock one day. Or it's because they don't own any property and have no assets. If you have no property and have no assets, you're deemed to be a pauper anyway. Unless you hold property, you are deemed to be an incompetent pauper. So that's an interesting thing. You have to act as though you are a holder of property, even if that property is your own thoughts and ideas. Interesting concept. But this is basically true, what they say about this idea that the real you is not the legal fiction. Of course it's not. You are a divine human being, and you have to see yourself as separate from that. Once you see yourself separate, that is the most important thing about this concept. This whole concept of not being a legal entity takes you into another thing, because it means that that name written down when you see it is not you. That's the most important thing you can actually get out of this. It means that you are not this legal entity who's being administered against, and then you can look at it in a different way and go, okay, that's my name within the system, but that's not me. Then you can start playing with it, and then you can have quite a lot of success, because you start to realize the whole thing is based on a fiction, and ultimately based on massive amounts of fraud and, of course, land piracy. So the legal assumption merely means that you are treated as property because your parents registered or willingly gave you to the state. And by being registered to the Crown, a corporate entity, your person or legal name is created along with the benefits and liabilities of that registration, and of course what registration creates. So yes, what is a legal fiction? Let's have a look at this next. What is a legal fiction? This legal name or legal fiction is not the real you. I have to reiterate that. But it's a kind of trading name, a business or corporate identity. It is a title used to transfer assets and liabilities. It incorporates you as an estate on a roll through registration. So that's just a recap of where we've got so far. But this identity can only exist in legal form on paper. It is essential if you want to participate in and get the benefit privileges of society, for example, welfare, loans, mortgages, pensions, and any other benefit, including fines, tax, and imprisonment. Those are all basically how the legal entity operates. It cannot operate in the system if it's not a legal entity. You are either in or out of the system, so clever people know when to play the game and when to withdraw from it. As Kenny Rogers says, you've got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. So these are all benefits, basically, of the legal name being incorporated through basic contract. The contract or meeting of minds with the birth certificates which was between your parents and the state, the registrar. You didn't object because you knew nothing about it, but as your parents found out later on in life, ignorance of the law is no excuse, which is, of course, a Roman maxim. Now, due to the monetary system being based on the creation of credit through what is known as fractional reserve banking, basically it means that a bank can hold up to 10 times the amount of money it's actually got, or the amount of assets that it holds. And that has been surpassed now. I mean, we're talking about massive fraud here. So fractional reserve banking is now really money laundering, and it's complete fraud. So that's where the problem really started, with the extension of fractional reserve banking into going further and further with the amount of assets that are held compared to what they are actually trading in and using, which is where your birth certificate comes into, as we've just said, through this bond system and creating futures on the market. So this makes sense when money is created out of thin air in the form of credit, doesn't it? So the other assumption is that we are born into a bankrupt system and are therefore registered paupers in eternal debt slavery to the state And this stuff goes very deep, but I try and keep it quite simple. Now, a big error of some operating under the banner of Freeman on the land is that the legal fiction or registered name is worth a certain amount of money to the state, and that if you can find the route to get that money, it's all yours. As we've just said earlier, complete fantasy nonsense. It's a legal fiction and doesn't actually exist. It exists as a future, or it exists as basically a bond which is transferred and operates offshore. It doesn't mean that because it's your name that you have anything to do with it. It's operating as a bond number through your birth certificate. It's not yours, though, and that's the big mistake these people make all the time. Now, there was a fellow called Winston Shrout a few years ago, and he was a sovereign citizen who lost his court case. I was following his work for many, many years. Some of these people who were doing this stuff were very clever. Some of them came massively unstuck, because basically he got done for not filing documents to federal agencies, not filling tax returns. So that means that he was already operating with the system. Then he tried not to operate in it. The idea is to operate in the system to a very small degree so you can keep your real assets out of the system. And that's what sensible people do. Okay, yes, sovereign citizen Winston Shrout loses court case. Look at that, it's quite interesting. So, yeah, he was looking at the biblical implications of it all. Very interesting fella. But ultimately, it can't work in the system that we're in now, which is unfortunate. But there were other people around at the time. Look at a fella called Bill Thornton. No one talks about him anymore. He was fantastic in court, steering the court into common law, not just going in saying I'm not a legal fiction, but steering the court. Now, that takes a bit of skill, and that takes a little bit of know-how, and it's got nothing to do with the way most people are reacting and are being triggered into reacting when they mess up within the system. So yeah, this documentation, which claims the legal fiction, was basically the subject of much investigation by myself over the years and many others. And the net result is that nothing happened and there's no response, or just a brush off when we tried to actually get into looking at our legal fictions, our birth certificates and all the rest of it. But as I say, I did find myself on Fidelity Investments. Now basically, let's just recap. This is all because underlying this is such massive fraud. And one example of this is with so-called accounts being set up in your name by the likes of debt collection agencies, which I referred to earlier. The debt collection agencies have extinguished the debt by purchasing it by transfer of title, the deed. So they basically buy the deed off the creditor. So the creditor then has sold your debt, which means that the debt collection agency have to write to you, or they often threaten you with a lawyer who works within the debt collection agency. And basically, it's all about coercion, because they bought the debt, they extinguished your debt. All they will have to do is get you into a contractual agreement by setting up what they call an account. There's no account because there's not two signatures, but once you pay into that, you are cooperating with them. And they can then come back on you and say, yes, you've agreed that the debt still exists and you're paying it off. So therefore, you have a legal duty to do it. And that's even at a point where you can still get out of it there. And I've helped a few people with that. So even if you default on an agreement with a debt collector, you can still basically use that argument that there is no deed of assignment. That debt was never assigned properly by the creditor. Therefore, the debt collector bought it and it was extinguished on purchase. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And I think that when people go no contract return to sender, they are being completely common law Malcolm there, because all you have to do is phone them up and ask for the deed of assignment. You'll never hear from them again, or shouldn't do. They might still keep sending letters out, computer-generated ones, but unless there is a deed of assignment, then there's no real debt. Yeah, so that's basically how legal fictions work. In one case, I remember the IRS sent the person making the claim, basically through this unlocking of the birth bond, they sent them a tax number and threatened them with tax evasion in the United States, which was absolutely hilarious, you know. Now and again, someone would claim that they had found the route to their millions, of course, but guess what? There was never any proof. Remedy gurus appeared, held workshops, took people's money, then guess what? They disappeared again. Yes, this in itself meant that the whole thing was likely used, I think, as a carrot-dangling exercise to divert people away from much more important issues, which could be hugely advantageous to learn, such as the Bills of Exchange Act and competence when dealing with your own estate, and of course with police, councils and courts. Now, the only outcome of all this earnest inquiry about looking at these birth bonds and the UCC code and following the avenues that people were following years ago was that most of these people are probably now on a list of easily manipulated lunatics, or basically hundreds of years ago they would have been hung, drawn and quartered for high treason by attempting to undermine the authority of the crown. Well, Mark, we are winning. This is very negative, Mark. We are winning. We are winning. The common law convoy is going around the M25 all night long, and we've tried many members of the building known as the Houses of Parliament, Mark, and common law not restaurants. Common law arrest warrants, Mark, are going to be issued. I'm a little bit tired, and we're on the verge of something massive here, Mark. So I'm going to have another cup of tea, okay? And see you later. Thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, that's great. So the main point missed by Freeman on the Land was that if you were incorporated as a legal fiction, your legal fiction is just that. It's a fiction. It has no real value. A little bit like the money you carry around, but the money that you carry around is backed up by confidence in it as currency. And that confidence, of course, can be undermined at any time, as we've seen through history. So the reason your promissory notes or pounds in your pocket are worth something is that they have value in the recognised monetary system we're in. It is the belief that they have value that gives them value. Nothing else. There's nothing else to it, as they cannot be exchanged for anything except any banknote issued which states it is backed by a promise of payment in sterling, like pounds used to be. If you look on a £10 note now, you will actually see it says, I promise to pay the bearer upon demand the sum of £10, but it doesn't say £10 of what. One of the Scottish banknotes, there's two, there's Bank of Scotland and Bank of Clydesdale, I think. Last time I looked, I think it's the Clydesdale Bank was backed by sterling. You could still get sterling for your fiat currency if you went to the bank. I'm not sure how they would react to that now. It'd be interesting to find out. But just check that there was two different Scottish banknotes. People in Scotland know what I'm talking about. Okay, your legal fiction is not publicly recognised by the state, so it can never be worth anything except as a financial future for the state. That's the lesson here. It is theirs and can never be yours. There seems to be a lot of confusion about this, but you cannot make a claim on a legal fiction set up under your name as it was registered to the state. So basically, that registration and that legal fiction through the birth certificate is something that is not yours. It was set up by the state. There is also the assumption by freemen who argue that your debts are not yours either. Well, we've just gone through that. But what they do is put their foot in it by not paying them. What you have to do is act accordingly and with responsibility and know how to administer your estate. And that's what I've been saying and touching on tonight. There is a legal argument for some of this stuff that's in the Freeman on the Land, in that debts can be offset, and often debt is created by third parties and debt collectors, and these are not real debts, as we've been covering tonight, or they're debts that have been extinguished. They are made up and have no value in equity. That's something that's very important. So you have to work out how they're doing this, and that's what we're really talking about in this particular show. There is even a good argument that all debts and liabilities can be offset, and offsetting debt is something that can be done. And once you learn how things like the Bills of Exchange Act operate, then you can start doing some quite interesting manoeuvres within this area. So the debts bought up by debt collectors have been bought by them, so they have to get you into an agreement by setting up an account in your name. It's not a real account, as you did not agree, and the setting up of an account requires 2 signatures. That's a recap on that. Now, that this is interesting, actually. There is a way, of writing off assumed debts in some cases unless their value can be proven in equity. Now, equity and trust law are the most powerful forms of recourse in the system, but of course they're being undermined by people who are setting up these fake trusts, these universal common law trusts, which are not proper trusts because they're not adhering to the rules of trust law. So these people are massively undermining trust law. And I did an article called, what was it called? The Age of Constant Distraction. Take a look at that, because that describes how these charlatans are undermining your ability to operate within the system, and that's something I really do object to. And also, there's a fellow called Paul Webster, and his stuff on British gas and bank gyro credits is very interesting. So look up his stuff, Paul Webster. We had him on the show a couple of times. He knows his stuff with this. He really does. He's been into court and he's written off a lot of stuff. So, yeah, have a listen to that. Paul Webster, British gas and bank gyro credits. It's years old, but it'll give you some more insight into the creation of debts and liabilities. So yes, years ago, in a very fine Malcolm moment, we went into court and put the legal fiction, the birth certificate, into the dock in a council tax case. And this is what the administrative court summoned, you see, the legal fiction. And it's called Councils, Courts and Conmen. It's linked to the article Freeman versus Legal Fiction at windowsontheworld.net. So the point is that unless you are going to administer or correctly challenge the controversy or a debt, they don't need you in the court. It's all about the legal fiction. Goes back to my joke at the beginning of the show. Yes, Your Honour, I am not the legal fiction represented by the birth certificate. Yes, I can see that. Just sit down. That's basically what happens. This is administrative law. It's just a commercial transaction done in your legal name. This can never and it can even cross into criminal. Now, this is a very important thing, because they brought this thing called quasi-criminal, where basically administrative courts can bring in arrest warrants. And this was being done by the state for assumed debt through things like the Child Support Agency. It was all challenged and taken apart. And when you get an arrest warrant for council tax, you can basically dismiss that. They cannot arrest you for that. And if you ever get anything like that on paper from a debt collection company, what you need to do is phone up the police, ask if there's a warrant out for your arrest, and they will say no. And then you go back to that debt collector and say, you are engaging in perverting the course of public justice by saying this. It's absolutely unlawful to do that. But this is the problem, that these bailiff companies have been deregulated. They're fully supported by people within the court who will actually put together orders for them for the possession of your house. Now, this is all meant to go in the High Court. I don't want to get too complicated, but with this stuff, if you've got someone proceeding against you for a debt against your house, you need to go straight away to the Royal Courts of Justice, unless, of course, it's just a debt collector. They can't do that. But you have to keep your eye on it, and definitely don't just send it back, because what could be the next envelope could be a county court summons. And that order, that unlawful order, could be passed in that unlawful court, because it is unlawful the way they do it. And they're done in private, by the way. All courts are public, and every court is a court of public record. However, these are private courts. They don't even exist as court cases. Shock, horror. Yes, so by not actually responding, you are agreeing. Therefore, if a court case comes up, you will be administered against as if you have agreed to what the claim is against you. The way around it, of course, if it's quite a large claim, is to go to the Royal Courts of Justice. However, I do know people who've had £500,000 worth of property just taken from them, and that is with the complicity of the High Court also. So when people say that they have rights within this system, I would say, well, they're rather naive. What you have to know is the way it works. It works on land piracy. So yeah, interesting so far, I think. This is administrative law. It's just a commercial transaction done in your legal name. And this can even cross into criminal, or what is known, as I said, of quasi-criminal, which is where they issue arrest warrants. A friend of mine got one through the child support agency, went into the court after he'd called the police and found out that there was no arrest warrant out for him. He went into the court and said, I enter this court with my inalienable rights intact. They said, in that case, you're not coming in. And it was a committal to prison hearing. Absolute comedy. So that shows you the cheek of these people. On another occasion, it was reported that when they tried to argue that they were a living flesh and blood human being, the court usher said, we are creatures of statute and we will not hear that here. So that gives you some idea of how they're operating, right? Yes, so I was sent a link to get into this Fidelity Investments in America, put in my name and date of birth, and also I was the only person with my name at that particular time in the world and born on that date. And to my surprise, yes, a fund number came up. I was Maryland Municipal Income Fund bond number 429 with a 6-digit QSIP number. A friend also did this and theirs came up too, although with a different fund, which was interesting. So I was absolutely convinced after my research that we are traded and it has to be offshore because of the assumed bankruptcy of the UK. Yes, the country has to be a corporate fiction too, of course. That's how people operate. So people go, the UK is a corporation. Well, it has to be a corporation. How do you think it trades? It can't work in commerce if it's not a corporation, can it? It doesn't make any sense to actually say that when you think about it. How can it actually operate in commerce if it's not a corporation or it's not a legal entity or a legal fiction? Now let's get into the last bit of the show now. It's quite heavy going this, but the courts of admiralty and their rules were being disputed by lawyers and imposed in the county courts. This is admiralty law from at least 1296, so it's not a new thing, as we were saying earlier. This jurisdiction puts you into the category of property in a court of salvage. So this is what these county courts are, basically. When people talk about admiralty law, they're talking about this. So the common law was being ignored even as way back as 1296. So what was happening was the lawyers were getting very fed up about this. And it was, as I said earlier, I think, it was kicked out. But by the 1800s, it was not meant to exist. But of course it does. It absolutely does. That's the way they administer against you, even if you're not there. The analogy can be found in the fact that we have banks on either side of traffic islands, and you come out of your mother's birth canal, and when you go into court, you go into a dock. These are all admiralty terms which have been expressed many years over by esoteric people on the internet. The birth certificate is your bill of lading in this respect, to be shown to the port authority. And if you owe anything, the authorities can take it. You are registered property in their eyes, and the Crown owns that property. So the Lost at Sea rule, the Cester KV Act of 1666, also means that you are lost at sea after 7 years. The statutes were changed in the 18th century so that you were born lost at sea, which meant you were born as a dead person, so your life and rights all expired the day you were born into this legal system of administration. So if all this sounds like some kind of black magic, that's because it is. Words create spells, that's why they call it spelling, etc., etc., etc. So the birth certificate basically is a blood bond, or represents living, because it is in red, it's written in red, and it's signed by an informant, your parent. Your parents informed the state that a new revenue stream had been born, which was you. And so the informant signed it in black, which means deceased. The black magician controls through creating a version of his victim, like an effigy, the dried blood of the victim, or anything that belongs to or has a link, which in this case is the blood bond of the birth certificate, basically signs you away. So the parents signed you away through that blood bond, which is known as the birth certificate. Now, the Guthrie Card was introduced in the 1960s, and it's a card with your blood on it, a spot of the baby's blood, supposedly for disease detection and prevention. So, in other words, DNA was being collected since the early 60s. The newborn's blood is also taken with a cut at the heel, and they call this a vitamin K test, I think. But you'll find that most, pretty much all newborn babies have their blood taken at birth. So, yes, your parents sold you, not your soul, just you as a legal entity, to the devil, which is the state, who deceived them into doing it, and your parents did it willingly because of the threat of fines or even imprisonment if they did not register you. That's the Births, Deaths and Registration Act. Now, the belief in this rule of magic is that it requires your consent. Now, whether you gave it knowingly or without full possession of the facts is way beside the point. The only way out of this assumption is to realize your true power cannot be granted by being incorporated as a legal name or a fiction. This is the beginning of competence and means you have taken full responsibility for yourself and are learning how to administer your own affairs. And you can then see the difference between the two of you, your legal fiction as the birth certificate and your divine aspect, which, of course, can never be administered against by man, only by God in that belief system. So the main thing here is that you are not and have never been a legal fiction or title, as the assumptions are being made about you by this third party. And that third party can only administer your estate if you are deemed to prove yourself to be incompetent, which is what a lot of people do, especially when they're using free man on the land concepts, because they haven't fully understood what they're doing. A lawyer will do this for you at a cost, of course, but also they work for the Crown, so the state benefits massively from you having a lawyer to administer your estate. This is where competence comes in. If you know what you're doing, you don't need a lawyer. In this administrative system, you are deemed to be incompetent because most people are, and they need the state to administer their estate, which of course comes with a very hefty price. You can take control of that fiction and administer it competently and challenge any assumptions if you know what you're doing. So the simple fact is that this legal fiction is dead and the real essence or spirit is divine and immortal, as long as it is recognized to be so and as long as you are aware of this distinction. So this knowledge in itself is the most important gift that you can get and the real benefit of looking into the legal fiction and the free man on the land concept. So courts were issuing documentation to counter free man arguments 10 to 15 years ago. I've got copies of those somewhere. And the movement was hijacked by the state, basically to steal the assets and property of the gullible. In the world of administration, you see, a little knowledge is a very dangerous thing. So a few unlucky and incompetent legal fictions even found their real selves put in prison. So I hope that was helpful. Nearly an hour going through that. I've been trying to do shorter shows lately, but there was a bit of reiteration of material there, but that does help it sink in sometimes. And I think this show is one that you could play a few times. If you're new to this material, do have a look at all the articles that I mentioned in the show. Freeman versus Legal Fiction, Are Administrative Courts Unlawful? Is a Birth Certificate a Death Certificate? And Are You a Pauper? These are all assumptions that have been made. Once you know the difference between your real self and your legal fiction, you are on the way to competence and, in fact, absolute freedom. And it's a very good feeling. So that's it for this particular show. If you would like to help us out, please do with the Chickpea Fund, which you can do at windowsontheworld.net. We have a Patreon page as well, even though it's a globalist platform. Do have a look through the website, and remember that we're live every Sunday 9:30 p.m. at windowsontheworld.net on the live shows page. Subscribe to us there on Spreaker and also Odyssey. All links on the homepage windowsontheworld.net. Thanks a lot, everybody, and good night.